Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 268th New Social Environment. I'm Henry Addison, a production assistant here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between Sam Moyer and Tom McGlynn. We're also thrilled to have the poet Martin Corliss Smith here, who will read to close today's program. We start all our events with two important acknowledgements. The first is that here in Brooklyn, we are on the unceded land and waters of Lenape-Hoking, which still belongs to the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. The second acknowledgement is that Black Lives Matter. We recognize the legacy of settler colonialism as part of the many contemporary expressions of white supremacy. We honor those that have lost their lives to this violence. I encourage you all to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions as we do our part in the learning and unlearning required to undo this legacy of injustice. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Our guest today is Sam Moyer, whose artistic practice has evolved from its more conceptual and process-based origins to address formal and theoretical issues regarding the construct of painting. Examining traditional roles of painting and sculpture, Moyer reframes the painted surface as a sculptural field in which fragments of previously used stone are paired with hand-painted canvas to create dynamic compositions. She manipulates these found textures and materials into powerful and evocative abstract works that evince beauty, humor, balance, and chance, employing the handmade and ready-made. And our host today is Tom McGlynn, who is an artist and writer based in the New York City area. His work is represented in the permanent collections of the Whitney Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum of the Smithsonian, among other national and international collections. He is, of course, an editor-at-large at the Brooklyn Rail, contributing articles and criticism since 2012, and his most recent show of paintings opened in February 2020 at Rick Wester Fine Art in New York City. Sam and Tom, please take it away.
Thank you, Henry, and thanks to Rail for the occasion. I just saw the show yesterday after doing a lot of research, and I was struck, Sam, by the physicality of it. Obviously, you're using, these found stone objects, but maybe we can start with, like a genesis. We can go through an early genesis of your thinking prior to incorporating the stone. So maybe we can, Ty, we can start maybe we could start with the earliest slide. So is this something that you did at Yale?
I did this after Yale. I did it, I think for a group show at Rachel Uffner Gallery, and then I remade it in Berlin when I showed with a gallery that is now called Societe, or Society. And it was this photograph that I really loved, and I found that the simplicity of it could really be turned into a pattern, and that pattern was interesting to me, but how do I bring that pattern into space? And so I was thinking about this house of cards and this mirroring, and I built this trying to use the photograph as a sculptural element, and really, like, how do I elevate the photograph, but then also just use it as an art supply on the same plane as everything else? Because I studied photography, and there was always this preciousness to it and all these rules around what was acceptable and what was unacceptable and how to handle it and how to present it. And I felt very resistant to these, standards that I guess they're just passed down generation to generation, but why?
Yeah, that's, it's a great way to start this conversation, because the first time I ever saw your work in person was at Flag Art Foundation, which was a picture object show or something like, is that what it's called? And I just was really struck by the planar aspect of it. They were wall works, but incorporate these stones. But in tuning into your talk with Brent Lippman on Wednesday, it struck me that you mentioned that you were interested in your work presenting as photography, painting, and sculpture simultaneously.
Mhm.
There's this conceptual plane that you're establishing from the get-go with the work. In other words, you're thinking uncategorically about the work.
Right. I'm trying to level the playing field between all of the, set boundaries around these materials, or these, what would you even call them, categories?
I think categories is probably the best way to talk about it, because they become these conventions, and the conventions have expectations by both the artist and the viewer, and it's like you're in the interstices between all of those things intentionally.
Yeah. So something that I feel like I have to say as a disclaimer is that it also might be my age. And when I was coming up in art school, I went straight into grad school, and I went to Yale very young, and painting was painting and sculpture was sculpture. And then there was this true division of the art forms. And I think I was like right on the bridge of, right on the boundary of that not mattering anymore.
Right.
I think people just like 2 or 3 years younger than me don't like it wasn't a conversation, but it was still a very present conversation. And I was always put in a position of like defending, sort of the breaking down of those rules and those barriers, which is to this day such a boring, dated thing. But then it really felt like a fight worth fighting.
Yeah, there's this great statement. I think it's on the press release for the current show, and I'm just going to read it. It's your statement. It says the goal is to create work that exists in the space between assumed material roles and defined categories. If a piece balances the physical density of sculpture while echoing the speed or lightness of a drawing, it is an experiential success for me. The polarity of being and thinking is where we find empathy. I love that statement.
Thank you.
It's as if you're making a statement about how we should experience art, as opposed to, I mean, not your should, but how everybody might, as opposed to restricted to these categories. And it is very dated. I was just recently rereading Mel Bachner's writings, and in 1966 he was talking about this. In 1966 he was talking about just completely exploding the boundaries between conventions and expectations. So it is dated, but ironically, it seems that seems like recurrent too.
Yeah.
And it is a boring. It's boring, but it's so fascinating that for this very early piece you chose a rock image.
Yeah. So that's like, right. Well, rocks are kind of a primary essential for me. It's a maybe conscious or subconscious haunting of the rocks my whole life. But yeah, I will say with that statement you read, like part of what I'm trying to get across is that when you can create something that's defying the rules that you've always known around that thing, sometimes it brings forth the actual like essential nature of that thing more so. So with my present work, like having the stone float on the wall or float in space and sort of defy gravity, it might suggest like you reconsidering like the weight of that stone, because all of a sudden your brain has to do that math versus usually that math is done for you. So
right.
Sometimes in the defiance of the nature, we kind of come back to knowing something a little bit more, or reconsidering it or thinking about it in a way that, we've always just connected the dots automatically without really thinking about it.
Right. It's getting rid of that automatic,
Exactly.
preface just to experience. It's just Ty, can we forward the slides? I believe the next image is your Greater New York installation in 2010. And this also incorporated photography.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I provided these because we were talking about like photography as a sculptural tool or as an art supply, and these were just two clear examples. And so with this work, it was a lot about patterning, just like the other one, and breaking down the idea of pattern as shape, space, light, actual patterns found in nature, patterns made from patterns found in nature. This was a photograph taken of a coat that my mom used to wear, and then I turned the photo into the interior of these triangles.
What I found fascinating about this image is like it's nod to seriality, but also, Smithson was a big friend of Bachner, and he would make these maps where he would just choose like 3 inches of the map, and it would just be this long strip. So it was a map of a map. It was an abstraction of that pattern.
Yeah.
Making a printed matter rather than information.
Yeah.
It seems like you're doing something similar. You're taking this informational, what a photograph's compendium of a lot of information, but you're cutting it up and repurposing it, making it material.
Right. So then also, it's this material, but then because it's a photograph, it still holds all that history and documentation at the same time. So I'm trying to get it to play both roles at once.
Right. Yeah, that documentary aspect is interesting. And I guess in this case, you've incorporated autobiography as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Can we just keep going with the slides? I know we have about 30 slides, so I don't want to, I don't want it to drag too much. Maybe we just go back to the prior slide, Ty. I wanted to include this image as another early work, and I think it's helpful in these instances to show the genesis of your thinking, because it's pretty consistent. Like your thinking is pretty consistent, but what I find interesting is that the materiality changed. And so these are moving blankets that you stretched for a show at Cleopatra in 2008.
Well, the materiality changes as my experience with materials changed. I made these at a time that I moved to New York and was art handling, and I was doing an install for Nicole Klagsburn gallery, and they had these amazing moving blankets, and I was like, these are way too beautiful. Where'd these come from? And it turned out there was a warehouse, like I guess 11th Ave in Chelsea, that just had these incredible moving blankets, and I ran down there. I remember buying them and paying for the taxi all the way back to Bushwick and being like, well, that was it. That was the end of my money.
And then you painted them, right? I mean, these are painted on, right?
No, they're not painted on. They're completely found objects.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I stretched them like paintings. So this is more of that like old Yale crap that I was carrying around in my brain. So I was like thinking about sculpture as painting, and these were supposed to be sort of stand-ins for paintings. And I was trying to make this point that like these found objects were just as beautiful as a painting that I could have made. And I wanted them to, basically the installation, I'm going down memory lane pretty intensely here, but this installation was really about how paintings, before they're presented in a gallery, are activated objects. And as activated objects, they're on the same level playing field as all other objects before they're in this hierarchy of like, we're kings of the world as paintings on walls. We're the ultimate art object, right?
Right.
So I did this installation with these sort of precariously stacked as a dramatization of how paintings exist in the studio while they're still in the like human realm of objecthood.
Right. Yeah, no, it's and then they're lit very dramatically too, which has a theatrical element.
Always. Yeah, my dad is a lighting designer. He's a gaffer. So lighting, and also coming from photography, lighting has always been a huge part of my practice.
It's so interesting when you consider the critique of minimalism as being theatrical, like you're going right for the jugular with that, Michael Fried's critique of minimalism presentation being too theatrical.
Yeah.
Too dependent on the theatrical,
Yes. And I think that, I just a disclaimer, like this was 2008 or 9. And so I was still pretty young, and I was raised on movie sets, and I really, when I thought about making a show, I think my brain really connected it to making a show, as in like a movie, as in a set, a space that like a human body enters and activates, you know.
Right. Well, we can get off on a conversation about cinematic theory, but I don't think we should. But, you know, it is an aspect of postmodern art making, right? Can we go to the next slide? This is when you started to begin to use stone.
Yeah.
Am I correct?
Yeah. This was the first big show I did stone with. This was a really exciting piece to make for me. So this was Rachel Effner Gallery in 2014, and her space was I don't remember the word for it, but gravestones were made there. A monumentary, I can't remember the vocab word for it, but she has a really high ceiling, still has really high ceilings. And I wanted to bring that ceiling down. And then I was thinking about Robert Irwin, and I was thinking about the land, you know, all the land and space and light and space and land artists that I was a big fan of, and thinking about what would that be like indoors? What's the New York City version of that? And again, this is like very much a stage, very much a platform for something to be enacted upon. So that's a 240 square foot marble platform that you could walk across, and then that's a painting I made hanging above it, and then I hand built with two other guys that light fixture with like my dad consulting on the phone. Like 2 scissor lifts building that you know, beautiful light fixture. And so the light floats through the painting, and you know, I wanted the light fixture to be just as much a part of the sculpture as anything, and be exposed so you're really aware of the theatrical, sort of seeing behind the camera.
Yeah, it's very theatrical. And there's when I first saw this image, I didn't see the actual show, but when I first saw this image, there's some ambiguity as to whether the light was there. You know, and obviously it was fabricated to match, you know, the proportions, but I kind of like that ambiguity, and you know, also the ambiguity of the weight of the canvas. I mean, it almost looks like from the picture, it looks like a cast concrete slab, you know.
Right, people think it's cast concrete, but actually it's like the thinnest muslin with light traveling through it. So it's an inversion of that, which it, you know, represents. Yeah, and then it was really about the tone of the room, you know. So we're back to this idea of tone, which is the overarching experience that I wanted someone to feel in there. And you were invited to walk across the stage and live in that, be in that space between the light above and the stone below, and you know, the light that bounced between the two spaces. And there was kind of like a hum to the room from not an actual sound, but there just sort of felt like there was a vibration between these two aspects.
It kind of exists as a social sculpture because you're allowed to walk on it, you know, like it's an environmental.
Yeah, and we had performances on it. I tried to activate it in as many ways as possible.
Can we go to the, so the next slide, so this is also the same show. I wanted to ask you about the title. Is that a reference to Goethe?
More weight?
Yeah.
No, it's The Crucible.
Oh, okay. Because yeah, supposedly he said at the end of his life, more light.
Oh, well, yeah, this is the guy dying in the crucible, and they're stacking the stones on him. Goody, her name's husband. And
the Miller play.
Yeah. And then he's, you know, they're killing him by putting more and more stones on his chest.
So there's a mortal aspect to the reference.
Yeah. They're trying to get him to confess that his wife's a witch, and he just keeps saying more weight.
Right. So is this when you first started to do the wall works with the stone?
Yeah.
Okay. And again, they do approach minimalist painting, say like, you know, Rothko or, you know, others. But so there is, once they move to the wall, there is this vocabulary introduced of painting. I mean, it's kind of unavoidable.
Yeah, and they're matched with paintings, like canvas that I actually painted. So this was a very early iteration. I'd been making these dyed canvas paintings for a few years, and everyone always when you make an abstract piece, people tell you what they see in it. And often people would say that they saw stone, water or stone patterning in it. And it just kept being said over and over again. And I was actually in the Rothko Chapel thinking about what I was going to do for this Rachel Uffner show. And I was like, what if I just found stone that sort of emulated or replicated the patterning in these paintings? And so this is the very beginning of this. This is stage one of bringing marble and stone into my work. And I went to a stone yard and bought a bunch of scrap from them. And with this, it's like baby brain. Like I did a real one-to-one relationship where I matched the stone with painted fabric that really sort of emulated the stone. So in some of the pieces, people couldn't even tell which side was the painted fabric and which side was the marble. So I was playing with like kind of basic concepts of illusion and relationship and stuff.
And also like the dialectic between like the virtual picture plane and the actual plane of like the planed stone, right? Mm-hmm. One of the things that's so fascinating about marble in particular is that it's a metamorphic rock, and it's originally limestone. It's put under a lot of pressure over the ages, but when it's cut, it winds up being an abstraction of itself. Mm-hmm. Like we don't really see marble in nature like this.
No, I like to describe it as like a loaf of bread, and you're looking at slices of a loaf of bread. So
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I also love the way you described it as a time machine.
Well, yeah, that's all rock, but yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. But, the thing with sedentary stone especially, where you have every layer is, a very specific mark in time.
Right. And sometimes there's entrapment of like fossils, especially in marble and limestone. And you see this kind of like, there's an inherent narrative to the stone.
Of course. And there's also the site specificity of it.
Right. And the different colors.
Yeah. And often, the colors of the stone from the countries it comes from somehow like kind of trigger your visual concepts of that place. Like
right.
The beautiful green you're seeing in this picture, that's a Chinese Empress green stone from China. And I'm pretty sure that teal and gold looking stone is from Brazil. Uh-huh. So in some ways, these natural materials that come from these places emulate the visual narrative we have of those locations,
Yes. So again, it's a documentary aspect related to photography.
Yeah.
Can we move along with the next? So is this your first one-person show at Sean Kelly?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I chose this light because it seemed very like different because you can see through it. It's like an architectural intervention.
Yeah. It is. It is. It was made specifically for this space as a screen. So I was thinking about, the 2D, 3D, and presenting these marble paintings again, these wall sculptures, and how to take this 2D marble material and bring it into a three-dimensional space while really emphasizing its two-dimensionality. So this sculpture really felt like a drawing, and I really wanted it to, in this heavy-handed way, feel like a graphic drawing that you then could walk through to see this series of drawings behind it, oil on paper. And so in that way, to have it be part of the architecture, incredibly flat, but also incredibly 3D in this way where you physically move through it, I felt like it was encapsulating what we've been talking about, which is this, like, how am I everything at once?
Right, and in this instance, since they're framed with steel, it does become a drawing. So the seams between, like in some of your other work, between the painted parts and the actual stone, they're made real, and they're also separate. So it's interesting. The spaces between them activate the negative space and the actual space in the gallery. So what would be like the negative space, what would be in the painting, your painting part, from my point of view. But also the theatrical aspect is interesting too. I'm assuming that the viewer could walk through this.
Yeah, the viewer could walk through it, so it has a very like backstage. I was really excited about being someone that grew up backstage, and I think that I try to provide that experience as often as I can, where I'm like, let me just pull the curtain back. Let me invite you into this like second space, the world like behind the thing.
I always loved the double entendre with the Richard Serra sculpture, one ton prop.
Mm-hmm.
You know, sure, it was like propped up against the wall, but it's also like a prop.
Right.
So, you know, we get into the discussion of like, you know, is art a stand-in? You know, is it just the backdrop? You know, and those kind of things. Are painting just a backdrop? So those are questions that your work invokes, which is I find really interesting. I think we have some other images. Yeah. So this is the large room at Sean Kelly, and again, I can't help but seeing these as you know, two-dimensional paintings. I'm a painter. That's probably part of the reason why. But you know, they're using color and they're using asymmetric composition, and there's a lot of variation in some of the choices in the composition, but they all tend to have an asymmetry that's a little bit off balance.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, so you know, it's interesting when you think about these stones, because the stones are heavy and they're off balance. So there's a
oh right, yeah, like defying gravity.
Yeah, it's not quite like one ton prop, but there is an aspect of
like whimsy and play and impossibility.
Yeah, and also like, you know, what if this falls on me kind of thing, you know,
Right.
like
Yeah, that's tension, right?
But it's you're creating that tension with real things rather than pictorial things.
Right.
But
maybe you're making more of a connection to the realness of it when it's defying its physical nature.
Right. And you know, I think I've included, I don't know if is the GNORP the next slide?
No, more Sam Moyer, sorry.
I wanted to introduce a couple of historical context images because of the other thing, that the placement of the random, it seems like, I know it's probably not random, but like the random aspect or the chance operation,
mm-hmm.
even if it's not, you know, even if it ultimately becomes your eye, it feels like that.
Right.
So so there's an open-ended aspect to your composition that I really appreciate.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, that's a real goal. And I think that that's a muscle you build over time, to know when something feels accidental on purpose. And to know when that tension or energy really exists, or when it's too much, or when it suddenly your hand is too present and you need to pull back a little bit. And we talked in the conversation I had with Brett, we talked a lot about how I studied photography, and that editing skill that I picked up from,
right,
maybe is like the muscle that was exercised to be able to do that. But also there's just a confidence that builds with your intuition over time as an art maker, right? And so the artists that I really look to the most with that type of thing are like Gys Bend, or G's Bend, however you pronounce it, the quilters.
Right.
Where that is just like a inherited, passed down trust in yourself, like faith in yourself that your decision is an okay decision, versus having to like build up that confidence over time.
Right. Again, it's not relying upon conventions per se, or, you know, at a high art conventions, you know.
Like so much of my last 10 years of art making, alongside all of the learning that I've had to do, has been a great deal of unlearning.
Yes, unlearning is so important always, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like those things that we don't know, that we don't want to know, we have to unlearn.
Yeah.
Or something like that, you know, some Johari window exercise.
Yeah, just seeing the ways we've been programmed, you know, and some of those programs are awesome and become tools that are great to utilize in art making, and some of them are blocks.
Right. Can we go to the next slide? I also, yeah, so I always love this painting by Gottlieb because it invokes sound, like a pictorial image. But I couldn't, I know there's kind of like a pseudomorphic relationship to your work in this painting. But I think I wanted to include it because I think it's interesting with regard to the other dimensions that your work invokes too, not just weight or pictorial, but there's also somewhat of a silence. Is that accurate? Would you say that's accurate?
I do think it's accurate. I always say that like my artwork, the space that I make my work in is sort of like my secret personality. I tend to present in life as a loud person. I'm like chatty and I like to hang out. But my secret self is deeply silent. And in making my work, I think I get the opportunity to really indulge in that space, in that quiet space, and that listening space.
Yeah, it can be a space of contemplation and meditation. I always love this painting though because of the sounds being frozen, almost like that quote about architecture being frozen music.
I also think this painting is a good example because it really feels like two different paintings coming together, which is a big aspect of my work. It's like opposing components or complementary components, whatever it is. It's often two things from two different places coming together.
Right. So the next slide. And the other person who immediately thought of, I think actually in the Flag Foundation show, there was also a concurrent show of Ellsworth Kelly's.
That Flag Art Foundation show was an ode to Ellsworth Kelly. So made work. The three pieces I put in it were for Ellsworth Kelly.
Okay.
They were directly inspired by him. I mean, I'm directly inspired for sure, but those particular pieces were very like for Ellsworth.
Right. And so I wanted to include this particular Ellsworth Kelly because it has more of an antic feeling to it.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Let me just get I'm alone in the studio. Yeah, I was excited you chose this one. It's got so much freedom and action to it. I love it.
Sometimes people will associate Kelly with just like the really minimal like square presentation. He also has those drawings of plants and This is called aloe, so there is again a relationship to nature and abstraction.
Yeah,
and the Gestalt, that the Gestalt we put the precognition of Gestalt of nature. It's definitely an aspect of your work.
Yes.
And can we go to the next slide, please? Another really interesting artist here, which you directly make an homage to, is Helio Ortizia. I always mispronounce his name. It's Ortizia. The
Ortizia.
Yeah. Can we go back to Sam's? Yeah. So in this, you're making or not again, but in particular, the title refers to him, I'm assuming.
Yes.
Yeah. And do you want to just talk a little bit about his work and his importance for you in terms of an example or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just am very moved by the ability to simplify with his work, but then also incredibly complicate. Like he has this range in his body of work where we have these like incredibly minimal, but still have a little bit of like hand or action in them, small artworks. And then you have the installations that are just like, there's such freedom and you can see like the decisions building on each other inside of those. That I don't know. I think that range is really beautiful. I actually made this piece after I came home from Japan. was thinking a lot about the stone patterning at a lot of the shrines there.
And didn't you meet Isamu Noguchi's stone carver there?
I did, yeah, Izumi, yeah. I did.
That's pretty amazing.
It was incredible.
Yeah.
It was very special. So yeah, I was trying to really capture that. I think what we were talking about with Ellsworth a little bit, where it's like there's this projection or general idea of control, and really when you look at these people's practices, there's all of this delicacy and whimsy and movement in the work.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we forward to the Ortisia. Oh God, I'm gonna ruin his name. To the Helio. This was in a show. Did you see that show at the Whitney in 2007?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing show.
And you know, the rough translation from Portuguese is metaschema, you know. So he's thinking about schema, but he's also thinking about it in a metaphysical way, or a meta way. But to your last statement about, you know, we think of these people as formalists, but they're not really. I love the title of this show. It's called To Organize Delirium. Mm-hmm. So the relationship between organization and delirium is constant. It's not like one or the other.
Right.
And I don't know, I think maybe it's a point that people might miss in kind of austere work or work that it's kind of object oriented, but kind of minimally presented. If, you know, if you isolate any object and out of like the continuum of like experience, it becomes very kind of delirious, right? It takes on almost like an acid trip or something. It takes like if you like maybe this is related to the artwork, but things aren't isolated in nature. Things are part of a continuum. But when you isolate them and start thinking about like an individual object, like whole worlds kind of like start to come out of that individual object. And to some extent, I think that kind of that's what he was talking about in terms of to organize delirium. I don't know if it's his quote, but that there's this concentrated study of the object, of the specific object, and then that specific object, its contours expand. Its contours expand out into many, many possibilities. So it's actually the opposite of minimal thinking.
Right. Well, yeah. So this is something that I talk about with my work sometimes, which is people project a minimalist prescription to it when really it's incredibly maximal. It's got the stone, it's got painting, it's got, you know, plaster. It's like there couldn't be more crap going on in this thing. But because there is a visual busyness, it gets qualified as minimal when that's not true at all. And I think that the organization of delirium or whatever is really just about the chaos of the mind and trying to compartmentalize that chaos into structure. But really those structures are endlessly multipliable.
Right. I mean, if we were always, you know, if we were always in a state of like absolute presence, if we didn't compartmentalize our thoughts, that's what I was trying to say in a very long-winded way before. Our thoughts necessarily need to be compartmentalized in order that we can kind of just function, you know. But it seems like the role of the artist is to kind of just, you know, go in there and disorganize it and say, look what the cat drug in, you know, like.
I mean, maybe that's their job. Maybe their job is the opposite. Maybe their job is to organize their own chaos as opposed to take your organization and show you the chaos of it, you know.
Right. I don't think I meant it in a didactic sense, but yeah, point well taken. So if we can just go forward into, I think we're getting into your present show now. Okay, so this is an installation shot of your show titled Tone, which is currently up at Sean Kelly until the middle of April.
yeah.
Okay. So everybody who can see it, check it out. It's amazing. It's important too, because the materiality of these pieces doesn't come across in photographs.
No, I'm not a great internet artist.
When I was there, I noticed a lot of like breakage and like kind of what doesn't come across in the photos is this kind of brute aspect to them.
Yeah, they're made. They're, you know, often I'm breaking the stone by hand to get a shape that I want, and I would never disregard the stone just because it has its brutalism is a big part. Also, you have to remember these are remnants, so they've had this whole life. Maybe they had a purpose before, or maybe they were a tabletop or a countertop, or maybe they're the offcut of a tabletop or a countertop, and they've been sitting in a parking lot for a year or two in the snow and the rain and been kicked around and moved around and pieces have been kicked, so that life experience of that remnant is very present on the surface of the
somebody had a question, are they applied? No, they're embedded. They're like actually, if you think of like, the wood process of maca tree, they're kind of like that.
Yeah.
Very brute. They're not seamless. So sometimes in the photographs, they look fairly, the seams like are not discernible, but it really rewards always, of course, but your work in particular, since it has the virtual and the actual plane of the stone, it really rewards going there in person, seeing them in person. And these aren't all marble. Some of these are slices of concrete aggregate. Is that correct?
Some of them, yeah, that or slate, or it's all different. Whatever comes across my way.
So, like stones, especially like the sedimentary stones, not so much sandstone, but slate and marble. They're very friable. They're very fragile when they're sliced that thin. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting material because it's very delicate to manipulate. It's and when you see the work in person, you see those kind of really micro manipulations. A normal stone carver would do something called dressing the stone, which means making chamfered edges so it doesn't break, or it doesn't nick. That's why like countertops have those chamfered, that kind of beveled edge. But in your pieces, that some of that's evident, but they're very rough, which I found great. I found it a visceral experience. Can we go to the next? So these are three close-ups, somewhat. In April City, on the lower right, you can see the workers like overcut with a diamond blade, and you include what another reviewer called like the thematization of labor. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a highfalutin term, but like by including somebody else's mark, somebody else's drawing in the cutting of the stone, I found that interesting.
Yeah, I'm a thief.
In some of the stones too, it looked like there was like grease crayon, that a mason would mark the stone with as well.
Yeah, I think all of that evidence, all of those marks of the life lived before it came to my studio are really important parts of these stones. And you consider what you want to use and what you don't want to use, but it's all just part of the history of the stone. Just as much as we were talking about the stone itself being a time machine, that more recent history is just as interesting.
Right. There is a documentary aspect to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and an acknowledgement that these are appropriated found objects.
In my art historical hat, I would look at those lines of the overcut of like the diamond blade, and I would think of Motherwell's like marks in those open series paintings.
Mhm.
You know, those inscriptions that look like they're cuts, kind of the minimal drawing in those open series.
Yeah.
Can we go to the next slide? And in some of them, you can see it a little bit in Helping Hand, though it's kind of assimilating on the edge there. They break. Oh, you can see it on the bottom of the flip side. The stones break the boundaries of the picture plane, and they kind of jut out in somewhat awkward ways. I found that interesting as well.
Yeah, I think, you know, just relating back to sculpture, sort of mocking the necessity of the frame or the square, how we present, breaking through the boundary. You know, it's like I give myself this rule or this space to build something in, and then acknowledge that boundary by breaking it.
And also plaster is a new material in terms of your painting technique. That's what I picked up from your discussion with Brett.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I started applying plaster to the canvas surface around the stone, and it's been exciting because the plaster is in a closer relationship to the stone,
Right.
basically. And I think there's more of a equality between the two aspects of the work now, visually, because of the plaster. And the plaster allows me to play with light and space and shape and texture in a way that I know paint is capable of, but I'm more of a builder.
Right, and it has that art history of fresco. But the interesting thing for me when I thought about your incorporating plaster is that the way plaster is manufactured, it's like, I think it's quartzite is like, it's like pummeled and then like dehydrated.
Mm-hmm.
So it begins as stone plaster.
Exactly. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. So then we have the hierarchy of the two building materials, right? We have like the marble,
Right.
the queen, and then we have plaster, which is like the function, the wall coat, the thing, you know, something's physically made out of to protect it, to make it last.
And there's also, you know, this alchemical process of stone being dehydrated and then rehydrated when you add water to stone, and then it becomes stone again, to plaster, and then it becomes stone again, or stone-like.
Yeah.
So I find that interesting. There is this kind of alchemical transformation in the metamorphic rock. You know, it turns
Mm-hmm.
metamorphosis. You know, it's turned from one state to another, but also by using the plaster, you're using a material that has already been changed from one state to another.
Right. And I think that there's this feeling with the marble of like timeless foreverness with it, where it will be in that state. No matter what we do to it, it will always be what it is. But that's not necessarily true. And then maybe the plaster is sort of like holding the opposite side of what could happen.
Right.
A bad piece of marble.
Like more quotidian.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this is a detail of April City where you can see the cuts, the overcuts for someone's tabletop, and how you incorporated them. Can we go to the next one, please? So here's a couple of more this is from the current show.
Mm-hmm.
And these aren't that large. They're kind of medium-sized, right? Yeah.
They're like body size. They're 3x4, 4x5. Something I can manage myself with one other person.
And in Butterfriend, where that one piece of marble interacts with the other, like on a tangent, there's like a big break there, you know, like you can't really see that in the photographs, but it's like there's a big chip out of there, you know, so it looks as if there's this phenomenal action that happened.
Right. Is that action tender or mean? Like, is it violent or is it tender?
Yeah, that's a wonderful ambiguity to that. Yeah, sure. Can we go to the next one? we haven't talked about your titles, but I love the poetic aspect of your titles. When one title is a painting, an abstract painting especially, is probably best to go for like abstruse poetics, then apply like a representational aspect to it. Maybe your titling seems like in between the two.
Yeah, sometimes it's what calls to mind or how I've been referring to it in studio, where it sort of names itself, or I'm like, you have to call it something, and then sometimes you just call it what it looks like. So it's a confession in that way. Often the titles are confessional. They're the moment that I put myself like very autobiographically into the work, the things that I care about or am sad about or am excited about, or things I think are funny, whatever my personality gets to. And, the thing about titles is no one cares about them.
I'm not sure about that. I think especially with, challenging work, it sometimes offers a way in.
It offers a way in for someone that's curious enough. And for the curious, they don't have to know. So if you like the work enough, or it's challenging enough that you want to see what the title is, then you get a little bit of a ticket into it inside.
Right.
View of my mind to work that might seem a little non-inviting in a personal way.
This is like a total tangent, but when I was doing the research for the notes for this discussion, I was thinking about, sometimes I've worked with plaster, if you have an overspill on the floor or something, and there's a bunch of objects on the floor, the plaster will kind of cast all those objects and then kind of take a portrait of the floor, so it becomes like the floor's version of itself, it's the floor's view. And so it's another way to think about the picture plane, as opposed to just the integrity of the picture plane, which is like a Greenbergian conceit. Mm-hmm. But in my research, I also came across this term, relative to this painting of Daniel Sperry's in some of his passing moments, like Capturing Dinners, and he referred to them as snare pictures, which I found interesting.
Yeah.
There is this aspect of this, going back to the frozen sound image of Gottlieb, there is this aspect of, and a photography reference, there is this aspect of your work of a kind of breathless, like a freeze frame.
Yes, like capturing a moment in time. Yes, absolutely.
So the poetics of this title for me led me there,
Right, because it's an action. Because you think of an action when you think of it?
I think of a capture.
Right.
As one might use photography to capture a moment. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can we go to the next slide, please? And I also, I love these David Smith collages, because apparently, he had all these cutoffs that he would, they would be laying on the floor, and he just started to organize them and spray paint the contours of them. But again, this is not a pseudomorphic reference to your work, but they too have this kind of spontaneity of a freeze frame.
Exactly, or a photogram.
Right.
Right. I love these David Smith pieces. Do you ever just, it's like that feeling where you're jealous of someone's studio action? Like, that looks so fun. I'd love to do that. And I can. But yeah, I think it's a very similar, it's basically, it's a mirror of how I make the paintings, where I have these scraps and I'm moving them around. It's a little more cumbersome.
Imagine.
But probably a similar sort of meditative, intuitive decision-making process.
I do envy you for these pieces. I think these are wonderful because they're so
fast, so immediate.
It's almost like the sculptor taking a break, from working with the obdurate material.
There's also the like freedom within boundaries of work like this, where all he had was what was in front of him, and that was enough. Versus like the approach of making art of like, well, I have to go get the thing, or I need more, or I have to learn how to do the thing. It's like, well, why don't we just use what's here?
Right. Right. You never get to the point where you're just like, oh, let's just call it off, because I've thought of it and it's just too much,
It's like a game. The pieces are provided and you do what you can with those pieces.
Right. Can we move along to the next slide? This was one of my favorite pieces in the show, just because of its tenuous balance and the painterly aspect of the plaster. Is that plaster as well?
It's a plaster surface.
Yeah. And also, kind of related to some of the tumbling aspects of maybe David Smith and a lot of other people too. But what can you say about this piece? I think you discussed it a little bit with Brett on Wednesday.
Well, this piece was the last piece I made for the show. And these were several scraps that have just been kicking around in my studio. I tend to keep these little, they're almost like bread ends or something, just these little chunks that I feel like could maybe finish a piece or really make something work that needed a little like touch. And they just happen to be together, and I get really loose by the time I've made an entire show. But this show I made 16 works, so by the time I'd hung and finished 15 works, I was very warmed up, and I didn't really have anything to lose because I had enough for the body of the show, and so I just kind of went for it. These pieces were very close together. I stacked them up. You just have those pieces that come together, and this was one of those where I just looked at it, I let it be, I decided it was good enough, and then that energy was consistent through the whole making of it. Even like applying the background, I just felt very sure.
Yeah, it feels that way. It feels, going back to ARP and coming forward to David Smith, there's a playful aspect to it that it's like, really charming and engaging.
Yeah, and sometimes a lot has to be done to free up the space to be playful. There's so much pressure and mental traps and hard stuff you have to wade through to make a show and think about that presentation, that it's like an actor, and there's so many great actors where they will make them do the take 4 or 5 times just to wear them out so that they can finally do a good job because they come in so hot.
Right.
I think sometimes I just have to like be fully depleted to be completely in touch with the best parts of my decision-making skills.
No, it's a great point. I think, I teach also, and it's one of the most difficult things to relate to like a younger artist.
Yeah.
You have to get to the point of exhaustion so you can play. So they're like, what?
Yeah, well, you got to wear out all those ideas. You got to really go down every single avenue and make sure you tried it out before you can.
It's easy for an older artist because they've already done that. They've been there, done that. But
that's the importance of failure. Like, this is the lesson in failure,
right? Right. Can we go to the next? Is this the last image? Or okay, I'm sorry. And of course, a very important aspect, I know we're getting close to time here, but a very important aspect of your current show is these sculptures. Yeah. Again, lit theatrically.
Sorry?
Again, lit rather theatrically.
Yes. Well, then, yeah. The dream of these sculptures is that they're like a Japanese garden outside, or they're just drowned with natural light, but that's just not the circumstance of Sean Kelly's space. It's a beautiful space. It's just drowning in natural light. So I worked with the lighting system that was there, and kind of the thing that felt right to do is let's just amp up the drama on these and really emphasize the shadows and graphic connections here.
Right. Another thing that's important in seeing this show in person is that with a photograph like this, you don't really get a sense of the scale of these pieces. And when I was in the gallery, they're very intimate. They're very body sized. They're not like these monumental gestures. They're friendly.
Yeah, well, they were made by hand right here,
Mhm.
which is great because I've been doing most of the sculptures, like quote unquote sculptures that I've made in the last few years have been really large and required riggers and cranes and all this stuff, which is beyond exciting, but also has somewhat taken me out of the process.
Right.
And so this was something where I really returned to making it myself in my own.
You're also incorporating the process of casting, which if we can go forward with the, so in this piece in the lower right, you can see the casting and the exposed aggregate. Is that aggregate that you gleaned from like the beach?
Yeah, those are stones from the beaches of Long Island.
Okay. I have some experience in casting concrete, and I know that when you use river stones that are rounded already, there's less air bubbles in the casting, so they're actually great in that respect.
Well, I learned about them because there's these amazing seawalls on the beaches by where we live, and over time they've been eroded by the water and just exposed the aggregate, and basically it looks like they just use the rocks from the beach as the mix for the concrete, which is the ultimate like beautiful site specific artwork, right? And they're so gorgeous and they're such time machines in their chunkiness. So I was really trying to emulate that with these sculptures.
And you also mentioned the influence of Vladimir Osipov.
I think. Well, I stole a technique from him. Yeah.
Right. Which is what, throwing wet clay into the mold while it's being cast acts as like a casting resist.
Yeah, exactly. So like with this wall, he would have taken these rocks and put wet clay on them and then just smushed the rocks into the mold. And so when they take the wood away, you pick the clay dries out, you pull it out, and then the stone's revealed. Right.
So you hit it with like a power washer or something.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an aspect of the picturesque and the time machine being kind of like a preordained ruin in a way.
Exactly.
Yeah. Can we go to the next image? So this is a fabulous Osipov residence in Honolulu where he
on vacation.
Yeah. And but I like this image because of the way he's using stone, like foreground.
Yeah.
Bringing the inside in, the other thing I wanted to discuss earlier was like the whole idea of inside and outside and sight and non-sight with your work.
Right, which is the modernist, that's what modernism brought.
Right.
Especially to America, like in the 1950s, was this idea of like, we can bring the outside world in. We don't have to make everything out of plastic. Like we can, Breuer and all these guys are just like using natural rock and floor to ceiling windows so that this interior exterior line was sort of removed.
Right. And this, similar to your work, this symmetry and asymmetry. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You have the symmetry of the international style building and the asymmetry of nature kind of invading intentionally. Mm-hmm. Can we go to the next slide, please? Here you can see the exposed aggregate very clearly. And this is also soapstone, which I guess is that a form of sandstone or slate?
Soapstone is
slate.
It's not slate. It's I think it'd be closer to limestone.
Limestone, okay. And these kind of interlock like these puzzles.
Yeah. And this soapstone's from Virginia. It's one of my favorite stones. I should know more about it. There's the thing where like, I don't want to know that much about stone because I don't want to be a geologist. Like it's just like the tip of the iceberg. There's so much endless knowledge about rock and stone out there.
Well, remaining an amateur, the base word for amateur is love, right?
Right. It's like a great appreciation.
You want to have that honeymoon extended.
Exactly. I mean, you still know how the stone behaves. After working with it for so long, I know how the different stone behaves and what it can take and what it can't take.
Can we go forward? And so we're going to end up with your Doris for Doris. an amazing, I mean, amazing monumental gesture outside of Central Park. And this is presented by the Public Art Fund at the Doris C. Friedman Plaza. Came down in October. What was the public reception of this? Like, did you get, were you, when you, I know I've done public works myself, and one of the most rewarding things is like when you're installing, passerby coming by and saying like, what's this? And, you know, just asking these kind of non-art questions about, you know, what, that looks really cool. What are you doing? You know?
Yeah, I was really lucky to have, you know, this project's 5 years in the making, 2 years of planning. It's been very long. Like I started talking to Daniel, the curator, in 2014. So the fact that it landed in the middle of the pandemic was actually kind of great because it's an outdoor sculpture, right? So what more could people, what's the safest way for people to see art? So I was very lucky that it was very warmly received because it was a new thing for people to see on this, often their like daily ritual, which was to leave their apartments and take a walk in Central Park.
Right.
And it's stone. People love stone. They have a relationship with it. It's on their countertops. It's in their lobbies. It's, you know, entrances to buildings, and the physical park itself is made out of it. Our city is made out of it. And that's the whole point of this piece. And so it's funny, it's like people walk up to it and touch it like they're getting to touch an artwork, but they're just touching something that they have permission to touch every single day.
Right. Yeah, stone is interesting. You know, I did some research earlier on graduate school on Jackson Pollock, and apparently Pollock was like obsessed with stones. You know, like he put his hands on it, so he had this like intense like phenomenological relationship to a stone, and he would do the same thing with like an ashtray. You know, he'd like look at it, like over intentionalize the objectivity of that. You know, so I think there's an inherent human response to stone for some reason. You know.
Absolutely. And it's the same thing we've been talking about this whole time, where you take it out of its usual context of, you know, its purpose in our everyday life and present it in an unusual way. And all of a sudden everyone gets this exciting new relationship with it.
And you can walk through it. It's interactive. It's a social sculpture.
Yeah. Great for Instagram selfies.
Did you track your Instagram? Probably not. Can we go to the next image?
My geolocator.
Right. So this is a great instance of like what we were talking about before, of like this kind of freeze frame suspension of gravity, planar integrity of the picture plane, yet documentary with stone embedded. And then it's framed by this almost like Neolithic ruin type format.
Mm-hmm.
Like a Stonehenge.
Yes.
What is that stone? Like, what is that stone made out of?
That's bluestone. It's from the border of Pennsylvania and New York. It's mined right out of the mountains right here. And it's what, I mean, even the pavers that it's standing on are also bluestone. It's a very, very common material in New York. It's part of the bedrock of New York.
Right, and most of the old sidewalks that you see, like in Soho, for instance, are like big, thick slabs of bluestone. Mm-hmm. I always wonder how they, you know, how they actually managed to get those into place with like horsepower, you know.
Yeah.
Can we go to the next image? These are just like wonderful as like paintings, you know, for me as a painter.
Oh, thanks.
I love the palette of the one on the left.
Yeah, that sort of like desert peach tone.
Yeah, it's a great, like, you know, it's approximately complementary because it's undersaturated red, pink. But the distribution of those colors is just really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, you know, the compositions were made in studio. So this sculpture was, I tried to do this thing where I handmade a big portion of the sculpture. And usually when you have a big public sculpture, you just make a design, send it to the fabricator, and you show up for the install. And are like, well, that's great. But with this, like, myself and 2 assistants laid out all the stone and created all the compositions in my studio, and then took it upstate and were part of the concrete pouring process, because it's a process I've done on a smaller scale a bunch in my own studio. So we really, it's like trying to convince, I love collaborating with fabricators and crafts people, like people that know their craft. It's so exciting and fun to learn from them. But this was a moment where I actually had to be like, I swear it's going to work, guys.
So where upstate was that a particular atelier that you worked with?
I worked with Fourth State to do the steel work, and then they had in their what is it called, like industrial complex thing. They had buddies that were concrete pourers, and so they basically lent us one of their guys and a concrete mixer.
Yeah, because concrete, like I said, I worked with concrete. It's a tricky material to get right,
Mm-hmm.
It's very kind of temperamental, and you have to be aware of all sorts of like hydraulics, and so the clean aspect of these I really admire, because it's a very tight technique.
Yeah, it's about, it's convincing them to do a looser mix was really hard, because they're used to trying to make things as structurally sound as possible. And obviously we want that as well.
Right.
So we don't hurt anyone and it's a successful piece, but it does need to be a much looser mix.
I think we might be at the end. Are there any more slides? Do we have any more? I think that might be it. So we went a little bit over, but wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed this, and now we have an opportunity to go to some of the questions. And I'm not sure who's going to be fielding those. Are you, Henry?
Yeah.
Okay,
I'm on it.
So I'm just going to bow out in my role as the moderator here, and thank you, Sam.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful. I appreciate all the work you did for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam and Tom. That was great. And I look forward to hearing a couple questions from the audience. First up, we have Christina. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Okay. Hi. So Sam, you described the process of being in command of your gesture because of a confidence and trust in your own inductive processes, your own inductive experience, I should say. I would love to hear you expand a little bit on that point. I think you have actually throughout your whole talk, but if you could work with that a little bit more about this idea of being in command because of this inner confidence. You used as an example the Gee's Bend quilters. I also want to note that through this process of confidence and trust in yourself, you get to a point of empathy. So you're saying, as in Butterfriend, the question of is the cut violent or tender? So that there's something about a connection between trust in the process and in the experience and an empathic quality to the work. Hard to talk about, but I was hoping you could try to run with that a little bit. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it definitely has taken me a long time to be able to speak about that, especially coming from like a Midwestern household where we don't talk about the things we're good at. But it's a built skill. It's definitely a built skill. And I think it's just as much as the skill of knowing when you've hit on something and recognizing that feeling, or just as much as you listen to the material, you have to listen to yourself and really let yourself feel that moment when it's right. Because if you're too much in your head and you're too much making excuses as to why it's not good or how you need to push it, you won't hear it and you won't feel that moment. So it's sort of a codependent relationship between me and the work, where I need it just as much as it needs me, because I don't know how to find that space for myself in my regular life. my work's the only place I can do that.
Thank you for that fabulous answer. Thank you, Christina, for the question. We're now going to go over to Lynn Crawford. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you. What a great talk and what wonderful work. I have to remember my question now. You'd mentioned earlier about learning and unlearning, which is fascinating to me. Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. So I think the easiest example I could give is just having gone to art school and then having gone to Yale. There's this, it's not a stigma, but there's just this sort of like royalty around painting and all the weight and history of that. And I always thought like I have no permission to touch that. I'd have to study that specifically. I'd have to really like indulge in that history and material knowledge to do it. And sort of this like, you do what you know and you don't really get to do anything else unless you really put in the work to know that thing. And it's just not true. That's just something that was told to me over and over again by people that were protecting something that they were trying to keep sacred, which I totally respect. But I really had to unlearn that in a way where it opened up my practice, where anytime I wanted to make something, I just had to figure out how to get access to the things that I needed to get access to make it. So just sort of taking all those rules away and realizing like a material is a material is a material. If I want to use paint, I can use paint. I'm not challenging the canon of art history by using paint. It's so it was a lot of deprogramming from grad school, honestly.
Gotcha. Thank you. Beautiful.
Yeah, sure.
Beautiful, really great work.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, many lessons to be learned from you. We're going to go to G.E. Schwartz next. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Sam, and of course, thank you, Rael. My question was, the pieces in the gallery, they are mainly embedded in plaster, the ones that are hanging on the wall?
Yeah, so they're embedded in MDF, which is covered in canvas, and then the plaster is applied to the canvas.
Ah, okay. And of course, it's pigmented at times too, because there's different colors that you're working with.
Yeah,
right?
the plaster is sometimes pigmented in the mix, but most of the time painted on top.
Yeah, I was thinking that because of that, then in a sense, you're almost, with the pieces you're embedding in the plaster, it's almost as if the overall thing is kind of quotational, almost in a diary sense.
Interesting. Yeah.
It's like quotation, because I kept thinking of like quotation marks, that some
right,
things are embedded in, literally embedded
literally.
in kind of quotational as a metaphor for it.
Right. Some kind of bracketing.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that that's interesting, like where the work itself is its own frame, maybe.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question. On that point, I have a question. You kind of shrunk away from minimalism, which I respect.
I love minimalism.
Oh, okay. Well, you were teasing out you're a maximalist, but there's some kind of identification with minimalism. And I was wondering, there are disadvantages and advantages to both approaches, obviously. And I wonder if you have ever kind of found yourself looking to minimalism and looking at what it can offer. Because I just want to bring up my favorite singer at the moment, PJ Harvey, because I think she just has this way of opening up maximalism through minimalism.
Yes, exactly. She's a great example where it's like, let me take these really sparse elements, but then I'm just going to project all of this stuff through it, right? And like all these layers. So I think minimalism is incredible, and I admire the light touch. Agnes Martin is one of my favorite artists in the entire world. There is so much there. And I think the ability to edit down to nothing, even like Hemingway, right? Where it's like the iceberg theory, where you're only seeing like this much of it, but somehow through that, you're being communicated the entire depth of what's beneath it. Like that is a goal, but I also think that there can be a prejudice pushed on a minimalism, which is that it's an absence.
Mhm.
And I don't think that it's about absence. I think it's about kind of like purity or essence and how to
Yeah.
represent a lot through a little. And so that's all I'm saying is, yes, I absolutely look to minimalism. I try to reduce and reduce and reduce and edit in my own work. But then sometimes, in contrast to everything I just said, I feel like the effort to do that is strangling what I want to do a little bit, and I have to give myself permission to do what I want.
Mhm. Well, yeah, I was interested because you've been saying that you like theater is such an inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
And there's almost this other definition of theater in your work, which is like a city square or like an opening of space that
Right.
allows for attention within, you know, like, I don't know if that makes, makes
Yeah,
sense.
totally.
But,
Because I think it's about set or stage as much as it's about theater. And what
right.
is that set or stage when it's just like a platform or a space to engage, enact, observe, whatever, you know, that might be. So I think in theatrics, it's not the drama I'm after as much as the physical space.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you for that. We just had a question pop up in the chat from Salvador. If you're able to unmute yourself, we'd love to hear that. I'm handing you the mic right now. If not, I can read it on your behalf. I'll read it. Is there any interest in making a geography or map between the nature of the stones and the city?
I think that that's sort of what Doors for Doris is. It's a bridge between the built environment and the natural environment of the city, and that there actually doesn't even need to be a bridge built because it is one and the same. Yeah, I'd say it's like an abstracted map of those things. That's
yeah, and I was gonna say, because Manhattan schist, I think, is that the rock from Central Park? It's just like, it's a beautiful relationship between the Doors for Doris and, I don't know, those kind
Yeah,
of
totally. And
techniques.
that's a beautiful sedimentary stone that's just like holding the history of Manhattan in it.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for all those questions. We are now going to pass it over to the captain of our ship, Fong Bui, for some final remarks. Fong, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Tom, for a compelling conversation, and which inspired me to go to see the show ASAP. Probably tomorrow. I couldn't go last week because we was on the last days of April production. But yeah, it's so in hearing you think about all these things, about learning, unlearning, taught, and then untaught, the whole idea of academic intelligence, which we somehow were product of. We gone to school, you know, we meet amazing people, we read books, and we think about things. And then there's an intuitive intelligence. That's the part of it. So I see that very clearly in how you mediate, since you self-proclaim as a very lively, talkative person, but as an artist, you submit into silence. So that kind of tension or duality, or wherever the positive space, the negative space, I think we can think of the same in pictorial term. And I think it play out quite clearly in the way that you deal with that negative, positive space in the works, whether it's in, you know, painting or in this remarkable sculpture now that I see. It's very exciting.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's just so interesting to think about it. I remember once when Robert Graves, the British you know, writer who's known for having written so many popular historical novels, including I, Claudius, King Jesus, and The Golden Fleece, and many others. He also wrote an amazing biography of P.E. Lawrence, which I love. the same movie that was made, Lawrence of Arabia. But he's really a poet. You know, people who knew him well admire his poetry. And so he was once asked, so how do you manage to do producing all this amazing historical novel and at the same time keeping the pace, writing poetry? And he said it's very simple. It's like raising a very fancy dogs in order to sell them to feed the cat. You know, it's a. But you know, I was telling my team over the last few days, try to meet the deadline, and dealing with so many ongoing simultaneous activities around here. So I love to quote Toni Morrison, who say once, "If you surrender to the wind, you can ride it." And I think that's the key. You just describe how actor had to take so many, you know, attempts until they wear down to a total fatigueness in order to deliver that believable acting. I think that's exactly what we're trying to do, is to be mindful of how we surrender ourselves. So not let the academic learning to preside and dictate what we do.
Right.
So thank you for commitment, your commitment to that.
Thank you.
So it's very, very inspiring for us all here. And yeah, back to you, because I'm dying to hear Martin's reading too. So thank you, Sam. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry.
Thank you, Phong. Yes, let's hear Martin. So at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Martin Corliss Smith, to the stage. The author of a dozen books, mostly poetry. His most recent books include The Melancholy of Anatomy from Shearsman Books, The Ongoing Mystery of the Disappearing Self from Split Level Texts, and The Poet's Tomb from Parlor Press. Corliss Smith was born and raised in Worcestershire, England, and has studied painting and poetry at the University of Reading, SMU, the Iowa Writers Workshop, and the University of Utah. He lives and teaches in Boise, Idaho. And please find more information about him in the chat. Martin, you should be able to unmute.
I did. I have.
Great.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. That was great. I was I was in the mood for that, apparently. So wonderful to hear you, Sam, and a terrific conversation. And yeah, I mean, I was anyway, yeah, some of those degrees were in painting, and rather obnoxiously, I'm going to read a sort of quasi-essay called On Painting, which as the amateur here and as the poet is it's kind of dangerous to pontificate on what painting is, which is why I'm going to do it. So without any more of a deal, it's as I say, it's a quasi-essay. One might remain strange to the self by being strange to the world. See something as unknown and one tumbles into the ecstatic realm between. And from that, nothing comes back. Consider Shackleton packing the necessary goggles and gloves. It might be true to say that in painting, one cannot learn anything. One has to go again into unlearning, having methodically laid out the necessary materials. Better to consider the less famous explorers as well, because of course, most explorers, most painters, most everyone will leave no account worth reading. Even the talented will mostly paint nothing of worth, having already accomplished the sufficient. It is almost impossible to throw the sufficient away. Virtually impossible. Talent gets you so far, then it becomes your enemy. You must become a stranger to yourself. Being a stranger is unsettling, a self-imposed exile to an unknown country. Historical passageways lead only to rich people's houses. What can it mean to paint from nature? As if purity were knowable with our weary eyes. One must paint from nothing, or at least from everything into nothingness. The world must fall away, since all objects have become commodities. All objects became commodities when we moved away from making, from using materials. Painting had been materiality sine qua non. Now it must be nothing. We can now buy paintings that look just like paintings and are not paintings. No one would have bothered to make these if it weren't for the money. Really, the only time paintings make it into the news is when they sell. They are no longer paintings. The painting is neither home nor the workplace. It is undiscovered. It is drawn towards the human, lifted out of blind nature, the deer that is invisible. You cannot paint the deer. That's just man looking. You can't paint its commodity. You must paint its invisibility. I became invisible, having once strained and strayed into visibility, the idea that I was seen, which became a game of self-verification, until the game inevitably runs aground on its own self-limiting ennui. To be a self is to assert ownership of such a small corner. You are already capable of looking upon everything that you do not own, nor can you own it. A willow, a pond. What way is that to see anything? I don't need to open that book. It helps to have a home to leave, otherwise, where is the disturbance? Being born, perhaps, the turtle scuttling down the sands, immediate insecurity of being. I did a rather gory drawing of the Somme without rights or real duty, but there was some urgency not to ignore a genuine impulse which I could neither defend nor condemn. Anything at hand will do. A charcoal rendering of a tree, like a mauled Goya, the Somme. I do not need to name it. The seance calls out to the voiceless. And to draw from the earth, well, the earth as we know it is filled. The oil I use dries on the woven linen, the pigment drilled and ground. If I were to render it a color, then the choices are of the earth itself, patina of lead, petals of golden foil, dark smudges that must be ash or shadow. To populate the demographic of the dream using not words, but the language seeding light. It is a sublunary dark. The distant hammering is anyone's guess. The image, if there is one, is the arrested dialectic of its coming into and going out of being. Being is what the painting must maintain truth to, not an object, but of its being. The city ended up imitating the shop. The shop died. The warehouses had been storehouses and were now rich houses, having one or two ideas at best. The rich could not fashion a reality in these hubs. They buy art to kill it. They kill it into a fee. You don't sell art, you give it an expensive funeral. I just don't want to outlive these elms. I pray I don't. The child learns to be afraid of rain, and then the adult has to remember how to see colors with his lungs. There came a time when no amount of accuracy would work. I had disappeared as if blind, and there was no place to re-emerge. When I think of the things that I have seen, I think of the dark green ponds, a mix of sap green and Van Dyke brown, swirled into a depth of cool dampness, blue at the edge of the brown. You can't see it. The color comes from somewhere else. Humble nacreous oils on the vanished canal. Pyrrole red, alizarin and Prussian ochre, the edge of the lawn under the pines. I don't need to live in the house. I don't need to see it. Air turning under the limes. I don't need to breathe. I don't need to smell the waft of juniper. I don't need to hear the distant traffic. I don't need the rain or the barking chihuahuas. The left of gray and slightly yellow, the hover of transient pink and teal. Any of it and all of it, no need. Painting cannot be put on the wall of a restaurant. A painting can barely exist. It's not that it isn't robustly made, it's that it slides a blade between the giant pyramid slabs of the invisible and the impossible. If I were to show you how close it came to not being, life is really just a terrible accident, and the painting is easier to ignore as a transition between states than to perch as a fine object. People are paying more money to be uncomfortable. A rare moment when a sparrow enters the studio or a fly the gallery. We ought to be grateful. Crane, Dahim, the candle snuffed, the lemon peeled, the necessary fly, and the lobster odalisque. Better to leave the walls blank. The blaze of a mare's forehead appears through the morass. There is a splendid thrill in the proximity of battle. The swallow soul's disc lands on the impossible shelves. A pitiful head that has just realized it has become a bust, her eyes closed, but we know her peace is an ancient burden like the Sibyl's. I am a side of meat, butchered in reds and pinks. The sofa, the greyhound, the naked contortions, we hover in a thick, choking light. My love lies in a bath of orange pink. Because in the afternoon, I wish I had been a demon all my life. What I see, I desire. What I desire is out of reach. Thank you.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much. That's like my favorite poetry reading. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you.
Oh,
And
yeah.
thank you, Sam, and thank you, Tom. Everyone check out Sam's show at Sean Kelly. It closes, let's see, April 24th, right? Who knows? Okay, so try and see it if you're in New York. Thank you so much to everyone. The Rail is celebrating its 20th anniversary as a nonprofit dedicated to providing free and accessible criticism and community events. If you have enjoyed today's event, please consider making a donation to keep the Rail and our special projects free, relevant, and independent. And finally, please join us on Monday at 1 p.m. when artist Carrie Mae Weems joins Rail editor-at-large Paul D. Miller for a conversation, which will conclude with a poetry reading from Joy Priest. All right, thank you so much again. I'm going to unmute everyone so that you can say your goodbyes and thank yous on the way out.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks, Tom.
Such a great conversation.
Thank you also very much.
Thank you.
Sam.
Great.
Thank you.
Great conversation.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you so much.
Great to see the show.
Thank you.
Greetings from Monterey, Mexico.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great,
Sam. Good to see you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Gordon.
Thanks, Tom.
Sweden. Love it. Love it. Have a great weekend. Hey, Richard.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom.
Oh,
I like
go see Sam's show. Bye, you guys.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Adios.
Bye.